Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. This time we're taking a look at the birth of the legendary soul music record label Motown. In the UK, all the music is released on the Tamla Motown label, but in America it was a very different story. There were a whole bunch of labels under the Motown banner. You got Motown itself, Tamla, Gordy, named after the founder, Berry Gordy Jr., Soul, and some less well-known labels, Miracle Records, where the Temptations started out, and Workshop Jazz. That was the home for the Four Tops when they arrived at the label. As rock and roll was transitioning into beat music and onto rock, at the same time R&B and doo-wop were morphing into soul music, and one of the most significant record labels in this transition to soul was Motown. Temptations, Four Tops, Marvin Gaye, now they all came from R&B and doo-wop backgrounds. The songs emanating from Motown were also widely covered by British artists and bands. The Motown labels were responsible for many of the Northern Soul favourites, but that's a bit out there on the horizon at the moment. Maybe we'll come back to that sometime. Now, before taking a look at how it all started with Berry Gordy Jr. back in 1959, here's a classic Motown track. This is the Four Tops with Baby, I Need Your Lovin'. It all started with Berry Gordy Jr. Now, he was born in Detroit, Michigan on the 28th of November 1929. He was a prolific songwriter, producer. He was also an amateur boxer, and he sparred with legendary R&B singer Jackie Wilson, although his mother wasn't so keen on all this and he failed to become a professional boxer. But by 1959, he decided to start his own record label. And on the 12th of January 1959, with the aid of an $800 loan, Berry Gordy Jr. founded Tamla. He also founded the Jobette Music publishing company named after his children. That's a very, very smart move on his part to pick up the publishing. And at the end of that year, 1959, he formed the Motown Corporation and Motown label. Now, for British releases, he combined the names of those two labels, and in the UK, everything was released on Tamla Motown. His break as a songwriter came in 1957 with Jackie Wilson's Reek Petite. That gave him a number 6 in the UK and went a long way to funding the Tamla venture. Jackie Wilson himself, he was also born in Detroit, and in the early 50s, he was in a band with his cousin, Levi Stubbs. He was in they were both in the Falcons, and Levi Stubbs, of course, went on to form the Four Tops. Now, interestingly enough, Wilson Pickett was also a member of this group, but that was a little bit later on. Now, in 1953, Jackie Wilson went off and joined the Dominoes. He replaced Clyde McPhatter, who'd moved on to Atlantic Records, with the remit to form a vocal group, and he formed the Drifters, and that's where the whole Drifters story starts. He left the Dominoes 4 years later in 57 and had a very, very successful solo career. I mean, he had over 40 R&B hits, and an awful lot of those crossed over into the pop charts. Now, the first single on Tamla was a guy called Marv Johnson, and at the beginning of 1959, he released Come to Me. Now, that was written by Gordy and Marv, and it was the first single on Tamla, Tamla 101. Now, it only had a regional release on Tamla. The national release came on United Artists, and that actually took them into the charts, albeit the lower regions, but the United Artists version found its way to number 30 on the Billboard charts. Now, one of the absolute cornerstones of the label was Smokey Robinson and his band, the Miracles. Now, they all started back in 1955 when Smokey and Ronald White and a few friends, they formed the Matadors while they were still at high school in Detroit. And they came to the attention of Berry Gordy when he saw them at an audition. Now, it was actually an audition they failed, and that was for Jackie Wilson's manager, and that was in 1957. And Berry Gordy thought, now I like these guys. I think we'll have these guys on the label, and he changed their name to the Miracles. Now in '59, in the summer, the Miracles released Bad Girl, their first single, but it was actually on the Chess label. But there was a limited edition on Motown, and that was the first Motown single. Now, the first US hit the Miracles had was with Shop Around, and that came in October 1960. And on the label, they're actually billed as The Miracles featuring Bill Smokey Robinson. That was produced by Berry Gordy, and it got to number 2. Now, they had to wait till 1966 before their first success in the UK, and that came with Going to a Go-Go. But it went on to have a whole string of hits, either as the Miracles, Smokey Robinson, the Miracles, or just Smokey Robinson. But one of the great singles they released was in November 1962, and that was You've Really Got a Hold on Me. That was written by Smokey Robinson, and if you look at the record label, it says produced by Smokey. I always thought that was a great image to see on the label. Now, shortly after the first Motown single, that was Bad Girls by the Miracles, Berry Gordy set up the Motown Corporation. Formed that in Detroit. This is on the 14th of December 1959. And the recording studios themselves were very aptly named Hitsville, USA. And he decided to go for a house band for the label. Stax had got Booker T and the MGs, Phil Spector had his Wrecking Crew, and Motown had the Funk Brothers, a very, very talented set of session musicians. And along with Atlantic and Stax Alliance, Motown was a major player in transitioning 50s R&B and doo-wop vocal groups to 1960s soul music. I mean, so many of the Motown artists had their root, as we'll see, in doo-wop groups. Now, the first full release on Motown came from the Satin Tones, and that was My Beloved, and that obviously was Motown 1000. Now, it's worth having a quick look at what the next 3 singles were. Motown 1001 came out in October '59, and that was Eugene Remus with his version of You Never Miss a Good Thing, written and produced by Berry Gordy. And in August of 1960, Popcorn and the Mohawks released Custer's Last Man. That was 1002. And the writing credit for that goes to Wiley Gordy Robinson. And Gordy, obviously, Berry, Smokey for Robinson. Now, Wiley was Richard Popcorn Wiley of Popcorn and the Mohawks fame. And that again was produced by Berry Gordy. But he really hit the jackpot with Motown 1003. On the 8th of July 1960, he signed Mary Wells to the Motown label. And in September, she released Motown 1003, Bye Bye Baby. Now, it was actually written by Mary Wells, and it was originally intended for Jackie Wilson. But when Berry Gordy heard it, he thought, oh, no, we'll have a bit of this. I think we'll get Miss Wells to release this. And it gave him an R&B number 8 on the charts. And Mary Wells, of course, became the first female star at Motown. She had her first crossover hit in June of 1961 with I Don't Want to Take a Chance, another Berry Gordy effort. And the song's very much associated with Mary Wells was My Guy in the spring of 1964. That was actually written by Smokey Robinson and produced by Smokey. That was an R&B number 1 for 7 weeks, and it crossed over and was a Billboard Top 40 number 1 for 2 weeks. Absolutely incredible. It also gave Mary Wells a number 5 hit in the UK, and again that was on the stateside label. Now, sadly, shortly after this, Mary Wells had a little bit of a falling out with Motown, a dispute over the original contract, and she went off and signed to 20th Century Fox Records. In the beginning of 1961, Berry Gordy signed the first white female lady to Motown, and that was Debbie Dean, and her first single was "Don't Let Him Shop Around" on the Motown label, and it was an answer song to the Miracles' "Shop Around," again produced by Berry Gordy. I think it's time to hear another classic piece of Motown, and this is from the Miracles, and this is the awesome "You've Really Got a Hold on Me." I was famously covered by the Beatles. It was on there with the Beatles, their second UK album, and in America, it was on their The Beatles' second album. It was widely covered too. I mean, it was defined versions by Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers, the Zombies, the Small Faces. But this is the original version. This is the Miracles with "You've Really Got a Hold on Me." Well, that was the Miracles with the original version of "You've Really Got a Hold on Me." I'm Derek Shelmerdine, and this is the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. We're looking at the birth of Motown. Now, there's an awful lot of information coming across here, a lot of detail. If you'd like to peruse it at your leisure, check out the blog of the show on my website at www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Now, one of the most enduring Motown groups has to be the Temptations. I mean, these guys are still on the road now. And they came from a combination of artists from various R&B and doo-wop groups. They all sort of came together to form the Temptations. And it started out in the late 50s, Otis Williams and the Siberians. Now, they became the Distance, and they included Otis Williams, Elbridge Bryant and Melvin Franklin. And in March 1961, Otis Williams was invited to audition for Motown. So he invited his chums, Eddie Kendricks and Paul Williams. Now, Paul Williams was no relation to Otis. Otis invited Eddie and Paul to join him. They were from a group called the Primes, and they were another vocal group playing the same Detroit clubs. Now, the Distance and the Primes combined, and they called themselves the Elgins when they auditioned for Motown, and they were successful. Great. And they signed to the short-lived Motown label, Miracle Records. Now, they found there was another group using the Elgins name at this time, so they changed their name to the Temptations. They made their debut with "Oh Mother of Mine" on Miracle Records in the summer of 1961. And they had another couple of singles on Miracle, but it was their third release on the Gordy label in March 1962 that set the ball rolling for them. They had an R&B hit with that, got to number 22, and then all of their subsequent hits were on the Gordy label. But it's still not there. It would take nearly 2 years before their fifth Gordy release in January 1964 actually brought the Temptations some major success, and that was "The Way You Do the Things You Do." That was produced and written by Smokey Robinson, and it was the first single to feature the voice of David Ruffin. Now, he wasn't the lead on that particular track, but Ruffin had recently joined the band and he'd replaced Al Bryant, but it gave them their first crossover hit. This is when the band really became known as, with the lineup that was very much known as the Classic Five. That's Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, and David Ruffin. But more success followed. At the beginning of 1965, "My Girl" entered the top 40, another Smokey Robinson song, but this time the lead singer was David Ruffin, and that gave them an American number one. It also gave them their first UK hit. It got to number 43 again on the stateside label. We're still waiting for Tamla Motown to find its way into the UK, but one of Motown's biggest solo stars has to be Marvin Gaye, and he's another artist with a doo-wop background. I mean, he formed the Marquis back in 1957, and at that particular point, his name was spelled Gay. There was no E on the end of it. And the Marquis did have one single, so that's well worth hunting down. They released that in September 57, and that was Hey Little Schoolgirl, coupled with a song called Wyatt Earp. And they used Bo Diddley's backing band for that. And Marvin Gaye's big break really came when he met Harvey Fuqua from the Moonglows. Now, Harvey Fuqua was in the Crazy Sounds when he met Alan Freed in 1952. Now, Alan Freed is the guy who coined the expression rock and roll. He is one of the cornerstones of rock and roll history. He was a Cleveland radio DJ, and his first radio show was back in 1951. And that was 5 years before Elvis hit the charts. And he used to play black R&B music to white teenage audiences. He was very much one of the DJs responsible for bringing R&B music to a much wider white teenage audience. And the Moonglows were very successful across the second half of the 1950s. They had an R&B number one with Sincerely in 1954, and their last R&B hit was in 1958 when they had a top 10 hit with 10 Commandments of Love. Now, Harvey Fuqua wanted to give the Moonglows a new lease of life. So in 1959, he sort of basically teamed up with Marvin Gaye's group, the Marquis, and with Marvin Gaye as the lead singer, they became essentially the new Moonglows. But Harvey Fuqua in the early 60s, he moved off and became one of the early executives of Motown, and he took Marvin Gaye with him, and that's when the E was added to Marvin Gaye's name. He had his first single, that's Marvin Gaye, in the May of 1961, Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide, on the Tamla label, and that was credited to Marvin Gaye with an E. And that was written by and produced by Berry Gordy Jr. Now, he had his first American hit, an R&B number 8, in the summer of 1962, when he released Stubborn Kind of Fool, and that was co-written by Gaye and Gordy. And it's interesting, if you look at the label, it credits it to Marvin Gaye, and underneath in slightly smaller letters, the Vandellas, obviously of Martha and the Vandellas fame slightly later. Now, he had his first crossover hit at the end of 1962, the song called Hitchhike, which again he co-wrote. And Hitchhike was one of the new dance crazes that was sweeping America in the early 60s. Pretty much sort of started off by Chubby Checker with the twist, but then you had a whole host of these dance crazes like the swim, the Hully Gully. But Marvin Gaye was still a couple of years away from his first British hit record, and that didn't come till the summer of 1964 when he scored a modest number 50 with Once Upon a Time, and that again was on the stateside label. But this time this wasn't a solo single, this was a duet with Marvin Gaye and Mary Wells. But Berry Gordy's first number one came with the Marvelettes. Now, they formed in 1960 at high school, at Inkster High School in Detroit, and around 61 they became the Marvels. And they came fourth in a local talent contest, and the first three prizes were auditions with Motown. But they thought they'd missed out, but they managed to persuade the good people at Motown to have a listen to them, and Motown were very pleased that they did. And they signed them up, and they changed their name to the Marvelettes. And in August 1961, they released Please Mr. Postman on the Tamla label, and it gave the Motown Corporation its first American number one. The lead singer was Gladys Horton, and she was just 15 years old at that time. And keeping it in the family, Marvin Gaye was the drummer on the track. Now, if you flip it over, you'll see the B-side's called So Long Baby, but that shouldn't be confused with the Del Shannon song of the same name that gave Del Shannon his big hit. It was released on Fontana in the UK, Please Mr. Postman, but it was never a hit in the UK. In fact, the Marvelettes were essentially a one-hit wonder in the UK. Their only chart success came with the number 13, When You're Young and in Love, in 1967. Now, that was their sixth Tamla Motown single, but before those Tamla Motown releases, they'd actually released a bunch of singles in the UK on Fontana, Oriole, and Stateside. So they might have only had one hit, but my gosh, they certainly pumped some material over here. It just seems that the British audiences weren't quite so keen on the Marvelettes. Now, one of the groups that British audiences have been very keen on over the years, has to be Motown's most successful girl group. Well, that's got to be the Supremes. Well, they sort of came together, though they weren't called that, in the late 1950s. And some of the original people who came together then were Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard. Now, they were very, very sought after backing singers at the time. And they backed Wilson Pickett on a track called Let Me Be Your Baby. And they did a lot of work for Bob West on his Lupine label. There was a guy called Milton Jenkins who managed the Primes. If you remember, those are the guys who came together and formed the Temptations, and it included Eddie Kendrick and Paul Williams. And Milton Jenkins became involved with the girls, and that's when he changed their name to the Primettes, really to complement the Primes band that he was already managing. Though apparently the two bands, the Primes and the Primettes, never actually appeared on stage together. Now, sadly, in 1960, the Primettes failed their first audition with Motown, but never say die. They recorded their own single as the Primettes, Tears of Sorrow, on the Lupine label. This did manage to convince the people at Motown that they were worth a punt. And on January the 15th, 1961, they signed to Motown, and that's when they changed their name to the Supremes. And their first single came in the March of 61 with I Want a Guy on the Tamla label. And that was another Berry Gordy co-written producer single. Now, it was 18 months before they scored their first R&B hit, and that was a number 26 in the November of 1962. And that was called Let Me Go the Right Way, written and produced by Berry Gordy Jr. Who else? Well, another year passed by, more releases, but their first crossover hit came at the end of 1963 with When the Love Light Starts Shining Through His Eyes. Now, this was written by Holland Dozier Holland and produced by Holland and Dozier. And they really are a cornerstone of the success for Motown in the 1960s. They wrote dozens of hits for just about everybody across Motown, and now you'll find their name cropping up more and more as the writers and producers of Motown hits. Now, like all the other artists, it was a while before the UK caught on to the Supremes, and they had their first UK hit in 1964 with Where Did Our Love Go? But that was on the Stateside label. Now, we can't really talk about Motown without bringing in Martha and the Vandellas. They made their Motown debut in the late summer of 1962 with a song called I'll Have to Let Him Go, but their first crossover hit came in the early part of 1963 when they released Come and Get These Memories, and that was another Holland Dozier Holland, produced by Holland Dozier single. But certainly my favourite Martha and the Vandellas song, released in the summer of 1963, has to be Heat Wave. Oh, I love that song. And it's another Holland Dozier Holland song. It was an R&B hit for 4 weeks and made number 4 on the Billboard charts. So a nice crossover hit for them. But they were still waiting for their first British success, and that came with Dancing in the Street, again released on Stateside in 1964. Now, I think we'll have a little listen to Heatwave, but there are some great covers of of the song. I mean, The Who had it on their second UK album, 1966 release, a quick one. Now, when that album was released in America, the Americans changed the name to Happy Jack because they'd added the Who's first American hit single, Happy Jack, to the album. And probably the reason they included it on that album, it was a tip of the cap to their mod roots. I mean, they were one of the key mod bands, the Who. But it was also covered in 1966 by a Liverpool girl group called the Liverbirds. But this is the original version. This is Martha and the Vandellas with Heatwave. Well, the youngest member of the Motown family has to be Stevie Wonder. In 1961, he was introduced to Berry Gordy by Ronnie White of Miracles fame, and Berry Gordy signed him up as a little Stevie Wonder, and at that time he was just 11 years old. Well, in the summer of 1962, he released his first single, and that was I Call It Pretty Music, but Old People Call It the Blues, parts 1 and 2. And that featured Marvin Gaye on drums again. It was released on the Tamla label. But his first crossover hit came in 1963, released May the 21st, and that was Fingertips, part 1 and 2. And it produced by Berry Gordy. That was an R&B #1 for 6 weeks. And Billboard Top 40 for 3 weeks. I love it. It was taken from the modestly titled album 12-Year-Old Genius. Now, Stevie Wonder had his first UK hit with Uptight, got to number 14 in 1966, and that was actually on the Tamla Motown label. By 1966, Tamla Motown had finally made it into the UK. But my all-time favourite Motown group has to be the Four Tops. I just love them. My first stereo album, first one I ever bought, was the Four Tops, Reach Out. Now, these guys started life back in 1954. They formed while they were still at high school as the Four Ames, and that's Levi Stubbs, Abdul Fakir, Lawrence Payton, and Ronaldo Benson. And they released 4 singles before they found success at Motown. And 1956, as the Four Ames, they released their first single, If Only I'd Known, and that was on the Grady record label. And then they decided to change their name to the Four Tops because they wanted to avoid confusion with the Ames brothers. And in the May of 1956, they released their second single, and that was Could It Be You, on the Chess label. Despite being on Chess, sadly it sank without trace. And then it was quite a while, before their third single. That didn't come out until the summer of 1960, and that was Lonely Summer on the Columbia label. Now, the B-side of that song was Ain't That Love, and that was written by Levi Stubbs, but both sides were produced by John Hammond. And he was the guy that introduced Bob Dylan to Columbia. An interesting story in itself that we'll have to go visit at some point in the not too distant future. Now, their fourth single again was a couple of years later, not till the end of 1962. And their last single before Motown was Pennies from Heaven, released on the Riverside label. Now, in early 1963, they signed to Motown. Now, they signed to the Workshop Jazz label, not the best known of the Motown brands, and there were plans for an album called Breaking Through. And the album's described sort of contemporaneously on the inner sleeves of other albums of the time, as the Four Tops singing jazz versions of songs such as I Left My Heart in San Francisco and Stranger on the Shore. And if you look at the photo that was planned for the sleeve of that album, it's very, very similar to the one that was used for the UK sleeve of Four Top's second album. The Jazz Workshop label was actually wound up before the album was completed, and the project was shelved. But it did find a release eventually in Motown's Lost and Found series, but that didn't go till 1999. But It was released, that's the main thing. Now, the time they spent that wasn't actually working on that album, the time they spent in the studio, they were backing other Motown singers, and that was what happened a lot at Motown, particularly the newer people, the newer signings, would back the more established Motown acts. By the summer of 1964, Motown had recognised the potential the Four Tops had, and they transferred them to the Motown label, and they released their first single on the 10th of July 1964, and that was Baby, I Need Your Loving, and that was written by Holland Dozier Holland and produced by Holland Dozier, and it gave them a number 11 hit in America. But their first UK hit didn't come for another year until I Can't Help Myself in 1965. Now, the Four Tops went on to become one of the most successful vocal groups of the era. And unlike their Motown stablemates, the Temptations, who had a very regular turnover of singers, the original 1954 Four Tops continued as the same lineup until the death of Lawrence Payton in 1997. Well, like Marvin Gaye, Harvey Fuqua was responsible for introducing Junior Walker and the All-Stars to the Motown stable. Now, back in '62, Junior Walker was working with Harvey Fuqua and recorded 3 singles on the Harvey label. That was between April '62 and February '63. The second of those 3 records that Junior Walker cut on the Harvey label was Cleo's Mood. Now, back in the day, in the mid-'60s, I was in a local group, and we were looking for a new name. We thought it was time to update the name of the band. And I was in my local record store in Chester, and browsing through the albums, came across a Junior Walker album, and on it there was a track called Cleo's Mood. Now, never heard the album, never heard the track, just thought, wow, what a cool name for a band. So, very shortly afterwards, the name Cleo's Mood was on my drum kit. And then Harvey Fuqua took Junior Walker to Motown and signed him to the Soul label, and that was in the summer of 1964. And with his self-penned Satan's Blues, it was the first Junior Walker and the All-Stars song to be released on the Soul label. And at the early part of 1965, he released Shotgun, one of his most famous, and that was his first UK hit. It was a #1 R&B. I mean, it was a crossover. It reached the top 5 of the standard Billboard Top 40 as well. But again, it was another year before Junior Walker found success in the UK with his version of How Sweet It Is. And again, because it was 1966, it was on the Tamla Motown label. Now, by the time we get to the mid-1960s, Motown was really living up to its studio name, Hitsville, USA. And we've really been looking at how Holland Dozier Holland came into the picture, the latter part of those songs. Now, they were all born in Detroit, and Eddie Holland actually released his own song, Little Miss Ruby, in the spring of 1958, and that was written by Berry Gordy. And in the latter part of 1960, Lamont Dozier released his Let's Talk It Over. Now, Let's Talk It Over was written by Harvey Fuqua and Gwen Gordy, and it was released on the Anna label. And the Anna label was owned by Gwen Gordy, and she was Berry Gordy's sister. So you can see how the paths are all starting to cross. But by the early 60s, Brian and Edward Holland came together with Lamont Dozier, and they became one of the most successful songwriting teams of the era. They gave Martha and the Vandellas her first crossover hit with Come and Get These Memories in February '63, and in the summer of '63, the first Martha and Vandellas' first R&B #1 with Heatwave. They launched the career of the Four Tops, as we just heard, with Baby, I Need Your Loving in the summer of '64. Now, the Four Tops went on. They went to have great success with other Holland Does It Holland productions and songs. I Can't Help Myself, Same Old Song, Reach Out, I'll Be There. And also in the summer of '64, the songwriting team gave the Supremes their first American hit with Where Did Our Love Go? Now with the Supremes, they had a colossal success. Their next 11 American singles generated the Supremes 8 number 1 hits. And they were all from Holland Dozier Holland writing and production team. Now, Motown finally came to the UK with a Tamla Motown label. Now, in the early 60s, Motown had been releasing their singles on a variety of labels in the UK, Fontana, Stateside, Oriole. But on the 19th of March 1965, the first familiar black Tamla Motown label arrived in the UK. And the first release was the Supremes with Stop in the Name of Love, and it gave Tamla Motown a number 7. This was actually the Supremes' 4th UK hit. The first one had come in 1964 with Where Did Our Love Go? That was followed by Baby Love, which gave them a number 1 in the UK, and Come See About Me, but they'd all been released on Stateside. Well, that's about it for the birth of Motown. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it just as much as I've enjoyed putting the show together. Now, there's a heck of a lot of detail in the show, and if you want to peruse it at your leisure and have a look at how the whole story developed, just check out the blog of the show on my website, www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Now, I'm quite active on social media. I'd love to hook up with you. So please check me out at Twitter, at RNR Unraveled, and Facebook, at Rock and Roll Unraveled. Now, if you can see a theme developing here with the name of the show, the website, and the social media, it's because I recently published the book Rock and Roll Unraveled, and that tells the story of rock and roll from its roots through to mid-1970s punk. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to say a fond farewell and play out with How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, a Holland Does It Holland song. That was originally actually released by Marvin Gaye, and there's a 1969 cover from Long John Baldry. But from 1966, this is Junior Walker and his awesome version of How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You.